Hello, Stephen here from Let's Drone Out, and on the podcast recently we were discussing the new Betaflight 4.4 version and specifically cloud builds, why they'd appeared, what it meant, what it was trying to achieve, and I thought I'd spend a couple of minutes going through what those options mean and how they're empowering pilots, how they're enabling new outcomes with Betaflight. So, if you've noticed, the Betaflight team is about ready to drop 4.4, and with that comes a new Betaflight Configurator. We can see we're at the 10.9 version now, release candidate 2, RC2 is the current version, so let's say you've gone and downloaded that, and you'll be greeted with a screen a little like this. Now, if we go to update firmware, we can see that the options have changed somewhat. First, if you're on a release, we need to select release and release candidate to get the RC1 build of the firmware that's current. We can select auto detect and it's going to figure out which board we have, which is nice. And now there's another option below here. If you go classic mode, you're going to see things just as they were, but I'd encourage you to disable classic mode and have a look at what's going on here and try and put the pieces together, because I believe we've got a lot of useful options here. There's a lot of stuff that pilots are going to find very, very handy when they get into running newer firmware versions with F411 and F722 specifically. Those two targets are limited in that they have only 512 kilobytes of flash space. 512 kilobytes of flash looked a lot a few years ago, but what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is an explosion in the number of drivers that are being supported. For instance, different types of gyro, different types of flash chip, different radio protocols, different motor protocols, and also features including, GPS return to home, barometer, magnetometer support, things like this, all sorts of bits and pieces. And they've steadily got more complex over the years to the point now where if you're running an F722 or F411, that 512K of flash space is sooner or later not going to be sufficient to hold every possible Betaflight feature and also every possible Betaflight driver. When we get to the point where we've got more than 5 different gyro chips supported and a whole raft of different flash chips supported, you only have one gyro or one type of gyro typically on your flight controller, and yet you're carrying gyro support for everything under the sun. So what is happening now behind the scenes is when you select a board, you're not just installing a, for example, F411 unified global target with drivers for everything that you could ever attach to an F411. Instead, you're getting a sparse F411 core, and then you're selecting the drivers that your board vendor, Matec in this case, has chosen to supply. So if Matec have shipped my flight controller with an MPU 6000, then it's going to build an MPU 6000. If they've shipped it with a BMI 270, it's going to build in BMI 270, but it doesn't build in everything, and that saves some space. It also allows a transition without completely dropping support from a legacy world where we had a lot of older motor protocols from PWM through one-shot, pro-shot, multi-shot, all the way into D-shot. It allows them to be supported, but you don't have to build them all into the ROM if you're not using them. There's very few people who would run a quad with D-shot and also need brushed on the same controller. That's almost never the case, right? So this allows you to just build in support into the firmware for the things you need and not waste all those precious kilobytes on things that you're not using. So now when we click load firmware, you've actually got a smart button down here, and when we click load firmware, it's not just loading it, it's actually going and building it if no one else has built it. And you can see I did this just a minute before the recording and it's got a cached copy. But if we go and change some of the options, maybe I want to include barometer support, and we click load firmware again, it's now going to go and build that firmware. You can see the processing down here and a little progress bar. And it only takes a few seconds, but this is building a copy of firmware on demand for my specific flight controller, because I've said on my flight controller I want barometer support. And it doesn't stop there. If you've got an older AKK VTX, for example, AKK released some early VTXs with a broken implementation of smart audio. There was previously a special build of Betaflight which the team had to maintain, and that lagged behind because they had to maintain an entirely separate release just for this broken VTX. But now that's just a little click here in the configurator, and you can say, hey, use the AKK version of smart audio so I can carry on flying those quads with the latest firmware. So I think that's quite an empowering thing, and as we start to see more advanced GPS features, we're going to be able to expand on the possible options, not just gating those to the big chips like the F745 and the H743s, but allowing everyone to be able to use them, because if you want to use some specific larger feature, what you can do is remove some of the things that you don't want to use to make way for that larger feature. So it really enables pilots to get what they want out of the flight controller. I think it's kind of an empowering thing. It lets you use the quad how you want to use it. So I hope this has been helpful. If there's any questions, please drop something in the comments or reach out to me on Discord. Thanks very much. Until next time, bye.